You may recall back in September reading about Mr. Paulson's and Mr. Bernanke's bailout of AIG. It came out of the news. They just did this. They didn't even bother going to Congress. There's no authority in the Constitution for the government to give or lend public money or credit to any private entity for a decidedly or definitively private purpose. And so I'm reading about this agreement. Nobody's seen it, but it's reported on and the money has been transferred. But in that case, they didn't even bother going to Congress. They just did it. And so nobody was talking about their constitutional authority to do this, and I didn't want any of that money being transferred until the underlying constitutional question was settled. So we did the research with the assistance of a former director of research for the New York Federal Reserve, now in private practice, and we submitted a complaint in the federal court. We sued Mr. Bernanke and Mr. Paulson. And we also asked for a temporary restraining order to temporarily prevent any transfer of funds until the underlying constitutional question was settled. I filed that case late morning, drove home, takes about an hour and a half to get home. And when you ask for a temporary restraining order, under the rules you have to notify the other side that there's an application for a temporary restraining order before the court. So I immediately got on the phone and spoke to the lawyers at the Federal Reserve. I explained to them this case. We faxed them the 35 pages of the complaint and the application for the TRO. They were notified. I satisfied the rules of the court. I then called and spoke to the lawyers at the Treasury Department. Same thing. Explained the case to them and faxed them a full set of papers. And then I talked to the lawyers at the Department of Justice and faxed them a full set of the papers. Of course, the papers say, among other things, gee, they didn't even go to Congress on this. Not only is it unconstitutional, but they didn't even go to Congress, as though Congress could pass a law that would be repugnant to the Constitution. But it was a stinging rebuke that they didn't even go to Congress. Well, that night is the night, you may recall, that there was a hurry-up, urgent meeting with Mr. Paulson, Mr. Bernanke, and leaders of the Congress behind closed doors. And when they came out of that meeting, you may recall the long faces on the leadership of the Congress saying, oh my gosh, they're telling us the sky is falling and that we've got to do something right now. And they promised to come in with a bill, legislation, proposed legislation, to head off this rush to the bottom. And of course, a couple of days later was that 3-page bill that said, if passed, Treasury, you have the authority to print and distribute $700 billion. There'll be no oversight. Nobody will be able to challenge you in court, etc. And of course, that eventually turned into a much larger bill. So with the announcement of that $700 billion bailout on top of the AIG, we filed a second case saying, again, there's no authority in the Constitution for this. And those two cases are proceeding through the courts. Obviously, the courts and the Justice Department appear to me to be working together. They're really slowing things down. I mean, they're taking their time, they're dragging their feet, and of course, as they do that, more and more money is transferred. I mean, my nightmare when I'm checking out, when I'm on my deathbed checking out, is, I'm looking back and I'm saying, my gosh, the people that aren't any further ahead than when I started on this decades ago. And so it's a strong passion for liberty that drives me, and I'm saying we've got to do something here. The answer came in looking at what the founders did. I mean, when they found themselves in and our grievances are a whole lot, I mean, I think, far worse than many of the grievances they were suffering from. But what did the founders do when they found themselves in a similar situation where they were petitioning for their grievances? They didn't have a constitution that was being violated, but clearly they were being treated differently than the people back on the other side of the ocean. And so what we should do, I thought, was, okay, let's have a Continental Congress. Let's bring people together from each of the 50 states to discuss these issues and to settle on a course of action. We have to begin to push back. This is going to be a very difficult year. You can't print and hand out that much money without some serious consequences. And it may well be, there are people predicting that it's going to be hyperinflation, hyperinflation, and that you're going to need a wheelbarrow to buy a loaf of bread, that kind of thing. So what we've decided to do is have a Continental Congress. Here's how, and so we've been talking about why. It's time to do this, and here's why, and that's why. All right, up to 3 delegates from each state. 1 vote at the Continental Congress, but up to 3 delegates per state. We've negotiated with in Philadelphia, there's a 20-acre part of the National Park Service. It's run by the National Park Service. And on that 20 acres, you of course have the Independence Hall, and next to the Independence Hall you have the Liberty Bell, and then on the other side of the Liberty Bell you have a relatively new facility. It's only a few years old. It's called the Constitution Center. And in the Constitution Center they have a large hall. It's called the Grand Hall. And that's where the Continental Congress of 2009 will meet. The hall is big enough. We'll have 50 tables, 1 for each state, with up to 3 delegates from each state. And we've decided to add another 50 tables, 1 for each state. We will invite the state legislatures to send up to 3 people to observe, not to participate in, not to be called upon to speak unless called upon, but to observe out of our recognition of the role that the states were meant to play and were given in our overall system. So they'll be invited. I don't know that they'll attend, but they'll be invited. And then around 3 of the walls, there's lots of space, adequate space for lots of members of the we'll have to, please turn off your cell phones. Okay. There's lots of room there for members of the media, the government, and the public. This is not a secret meeting. Open covenants, openly arrived at, is what we're about. And they will be discussing the evidence behind the violations of the various violations of the Constitution. They will be discussing these repeated attempts, repeated petitions for redress of these grievances. They'll be debating what course of action to take. And while they're doing this, it'll all be taken down by stenographers, and so you get a digital a transcript of everything uttered in the hall. It'll be videotaped, and there'll be webcast back to the people in each state. There'll be state websites that hopefully more and more people will gravitate toward as news of this develops, and they'll be able to go to that website every day and see. There'll be chat rooms and discussion groups, and they'll be able to there hear from their delegates. Their delegates will populate their state websites with all the news, all the events coming out of Philadelphia.